Morning, we're going to be in Job, beginning in chapter 40. Children, if you're headed out the door to Children's Church, you may go ahead and go out. If you want to stay in here with us, we are glad to have you here as well. As we've gone through the book of Job, if you've tried to follow along with him emotionally, try to imagine what it would be like to be Job. Some cases, actually, probably in all of our cases, if you just thought about your own life in light of what we see in Job, it's quite a journey. It's quite a journey for Job without knowing any of the heavenly background that we know. If you think about not knowing the first couple chapters of Job, you don't know, why is this happening? You don't know what God's attitude is towards you. That's where Job is sitting saying, I don't know. And not only that, but we don't know exactly when the book of Job was written, but most of this book wasn't written. If you think about our challenges when we go through struggles and we have thousands of pages of God's revelation, Job might not have had anything written. And if he did, he had a fraction. Without knowing the heavenly background, without hearing God boast in him, without hearing God say, have you seen my servant Job? Without hearing any of that interaction, Job's entire world has been tipped upside down. He's gone from incredibly blessed, from a physical standpoint, and wealthy, to the deepest suffering. If you could imagine the richest person you know personally, that's probably about where Job started, or maybe higher. And then imagine the person who suffered the most that you know personally, and Job probably suffered worse. So imagine the journey without knowing, chapters 1 and 2, of going from there to there. And right now, while God is speaking, it's important to notice at the end of this book, many of you know the story, and we'll talk about it in just a minute, Job's restored. But God speaks to Job first. God doesn't come and restore Job to a place of prosperity and then teach him. God speaks to him first. Job has gone from originally thinking, I love God, I'm going to sacrifice as I need to, I want to maintain this right relationship, I'm blessed, to saying things like, God, you're just petty. He's picking on all the little things. He's overly attentive, he's overly critical. Job has gone there, or even to say, God has sharpened his claws against me and he's attacking me. Think about the journey to get to that place. And then he says, I've tried to wrap my mind around a system of how can I understand all of this? How can I make it make sense? And he says, and I can't. But in this journey, he hasn't only gone that direction, he's also grown in his understanding. He's come to the conclusion that he needs someone to plead his case because he's too weak to do it. He's come to the statement that says, I kind of want death to happen because then resurrection can happen and I can be rightly related to God again. He's realized that his system of understanding isn't really what he needed. He needed the wise God. He needed a person of wisdom, not a system of understanding. He's realized, or is coming to realize, that even the best self-justification, the best you can look at yourself and say, I did these good things, the best self-justification will end in misery. And he's had the thought, though he doesn't know how it all works together, he's had the thought that says, if wicked people can prosper for a while, then maybe righteous people will suffer for a while. So he's had this, and I think it's very relatable when you see Job going from prosperity, suffering comes, to see this mix of some really great conclusions and some really dark questions. I think we all, when we go through difficulties, we find that in ourselves. It's a journey going through these kinds of things. Job didn't instantly come to a great conclusion. His easy answers for how life was going to work had been swept away. And he was left to try and figure out, what am I supposed to do? And who is God? And so at the end of the book, when God comes to speak to the man who has suffered and sighed and screamed at heaven, what does God say? This is the third week that we've talked about what God said. In the first two, we noted that Job has been like the apprentice who wants to tell the master how he's supposed to do it, or like the child, like the toddler who thinks they know better than their parent. Job has been coming and saying, this isn't the right way to run this, God. There's some problems here. And so God has responded and said, look at my wisdom in the world around you. Take the wide world. God says, my design is complex, it's good, it's powerful, it's wise, it's regular. Look at the stars, look at the sun, look at the seas, look at the earth beneath you. And he asked Job, could you do that? Could you design it? Could you make all these regular, huge, cosmic things work together and happen well and be established? And then he says, don't just look at my wisdom in the wide, regular world. He says, look at my wisdom in the wild places of the earth. Go out and look where the wild creatures live, and the lions and the wild donkeys and the ostrich. Go look at those edges where it looks less safe and less regular and more unpredictable. And God says again, my design, though it's different, the ostrich and the lion don't have a whole lot of similarities. God says, my design in the wildness, in the apparent chaos, in the desert, as well as in the garden, my design is wise and good. And so he asked Job at the end, he says, can you correct my design? Notice in this first section, he doesn't tell Job why it happened. That's the question we all want to ask. It's not the answer Job needed. He doesn't tell Job why it happened. He doesn't say, Job, your suffering's not real. He doesn't make light of the suffering. He says first, when Job comes thinking, though he's a child, he thinks, I think maybe God's doing this wrong. Maybe his design isn't wise and good. The first thing God says to him is, look at all of my design. And look at the wild places as well as the regular places and see that wisdom. Can you make that better? Can you correct that? And Job's response was, no, beginning of chapter 40, I can't correct it. And I won't keep trying to. I'm going to close my mouth. I'm not going to talk. Because in these first two parts of the answer, God is correcting the attitude that Job has been adopting. We all know there's a huge difference between a child that thinks they know better than their parent and a child that trusts but wants to understand. And I'd ask you this morning, before we dive into this section of the text, where are you? When there are things about God that you don't understand. And honestly, we probably migrate between these two answers rather than having just one. But do you come to God like a child who knows better than God does? And say, why? Because I'm pretty sure this isn't the best way. Or do you come to God like a child who trusts, but still says, God, why? Because I'd like to understand. If you find your heart shifting more towards why, because I'm pretty sure there's a better answer, the first two sections of God's answer are where he deals with that with Job. And he says, can you design this better? Can you handle the complexity of it? No. If you find yourself coming and you say, God, it hurts and I want to know better, I want to understand, this last part is more aimed at that person. Job has gotten to that point now, and so God is going to move to respond to him a different way. Before we read more of the text, let's take a moment and ask God for his help. God, you're good and you're wise. We need your grace this morning. We need your Spirit to work through your word, to shape our hearts, to convict us, to point out where we trust in ourselves, to point out the places that we have fallen so far short of the praise and worship that you deserve. Free us from trust in ourselves this morning. Open our eyes to you as you've revealed yourself. In your name. Amen. Beginning in verse 6 of chapter 40, God continues part 3 of his answer. Then the Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind and said, dress for action like a man. I will question you, and you make it known to me. Will you even put me in the wrong? Will you condemn me, that you may be in the right? Have you an arm like God, and can you thunder with a voice like his? Adorn yourself with majesty and dignity. Clothe yourself with glory and splendor. Pour out the overflowings of your anger, and look on everyone who is proud and abase him. Look on everyone who is proud and bring him low, and tread down the wicked where they stand. Hide them all in the dust together. Bind their faces in the world below. Then will I acknowledge to you that your own right hand can save you. God, now that Job has gotten past this first point, he's gotten to a point he's saying, God, I won't argue with you. I can't correct your design. Now God continues, and God says, Job, you have relied on your righteousness. You've claimed you are righteous, which the book tells us he was right to do so. He was righteous. He wasn't wrong in saying that, but he had claimed his righteousness so much that he had started to condemn God. For Job to think, I've done the right thing is fine. He had done the right thing. For Job to think, I've done the right thing, so therefore God must have messed up by giving me suffering, was not right. Job, if you held, here's God's righteousness, and here's Job's righteousness. The one thing Job knew was his own righteousness. It was more certain to him than that God had done right. That's what God points at. God says, will you condemn me that you may be in the right? Are you so confident that you've done the right thing that you'll say, I must have done the wrong thing? Notice this language. It's really strong language to say, will you condemn me? But notice, all Job had to do to condemn God was to trust his righteousness more than he trusted God. That's what how that language is used there. For Job to condemn God, all he had to do was trust himself and his righteousness more than God. I think it's easy to feel like, no, I would never condemn God. I wouldn't do that, while I'm putting a whole lot of trust in my righteousness and my wisdom. And when God comes to Job, he looks at him and says, your trust in yourself is actually condemning me. And so God continues, having already asked Job, can you correct my design? And Job said, nope, I can't do it. It's too big, it's too complex. So God says, all right, How about you just design your own system then? You all know sometimes it's harder to correct something than it is to just start over. So instead of saying, Job, can you correct it, like he did in verse 2, he comes and says, all right, you take your arm and your voice and your majesty and dignity, and you establish a system of justice where all of the wickedness in this world is punished. Notice it says where they stand. In other words, don't wait and do it later, but at the moment, make sure every interaction in this world is such that the wicked people and wicked actions are punished immediately. He says, go ahead, Job. Now think about, he's already talked about physical creation, which is so complex. Now think about justice. It's such a light parallel, but if we start here, it might help our minds. If you think about the last time you watched a sporting event, and especially if you watch with fans who are cheering for both sides, what happens when the referee makes a call? All of a sudden, half the people think it was a terrible call. And half the people think it was a great call. Now, some calls look a little easier than that, but plenty of them. People will joke, you say, was that a foul? It depends, was it on my team or not? Because even in a simple thing like trying to get a football down a field into an end zone 100 yards away or 80 yards away, it's so hard to make a system that works and then enforce it in every situation. And we all know players are then going to try to get away with as much as they possibly can until you call it. Even in a football game, it's hard to set up a perfectly just system that always works at every moment. With, I think it's 7 referees on a field and then another one up in a booth and then instant replay and then we still miss calls in a football game. Now, make it not a football game that doesn't matter, but make it life. But let's leave the number of people the same. Let's say you've got 22 people. Try to make every interaction so that every single wrong is punished as it should be at the moment. And now make that 2,200 people. Or 22 million. Or 7 point whatever billion. But not just 7 point whatever billion that are alive now, but however many billions have ever been alive. The physical creation is complex. Justice is so much more complex. So God says, Job, go ahead. You can't correct my design. Can you take your own glory and majesty and dignity, take whatever you can find? Do you want to be in charge of wisdom for all of that? Do you want to be in charge of justice for all of that? See, it's easy to look in my life and think, this person did wrong. I've seen it. They ought to have consequences. Or maybe we do it for ourselves. I did wrong. I've seen it. I ought to have consequences. But could you design a system of justice for the entire universe? No. And God pushes Job to that, to say, can you do that? And by the way, if you did, notice he says, tread down the wicked where they stand, in the spot, in the moment. See, the world, Job has been kind of saying, this is how it should work. Wickedness should be punished and righteousness should be rewarded. Well, that world, if you enforce it all the time, a perfectly just world at that moment has no place for sinners, and no place for mercy. So he says, Job, go ahead, strike down wickedness wherever you find it. And guess what? You're going to find it in you sometimes. Then what are you going to do? He points to Job. He says, can you design it like that? And again, Job's response is going to be, no, I don't have the wisdom and ability to design a system of justice like that. So he has to bow before the God who did. As we move into the next section, we need to talk a minute about 2 creatures, which you've heard their names, many of you, Behemoth and Leviathan. We're going to take a moment to talk about identifying those creatures. And the first thing I'm going to do is say that's not the most important piece of this section, identifying what the creatures are. There's four main options people have used. People have spent lots of effort and energy to try and identify them. They'll say something like it's kind of like a hippopotamus and a crocodile. Could be some of the descriptions don't quite make sense. I've never seen a hippo with a tail like a cedar, so that seems a little odd. But that's one option. You could say, well, they were like dinosaurs. So they're creatures we don't really have around now, and they were similar to a hippo and a crocodile, but they were slightly different creatures. Do that. Another one people have explained, they've said they're like categories of creatures instead of just saying it's one creature. Part of the reason for that is when you say behemoth, the word like in Genesis 1:24, where it talks about creatures being made on the land, the word that it uses there is very similar to, it's a form of the same word for behemoth. So some people will say, he's talking about giant, powerful land creatures as a whole, which have a lot of different categories. I don't know, that doesn't make a lot of sense to me because Leviathan doesn't have a similar parallel, but some people will say that. And the other one that people will say is these creatures were used, this is a true statement, whether he's using it here. These creatures were used in the ancient Near East to talk about mythical creatures that represented chaos and destruction and power. Those are your basic four options. If you come to me and go, hey, you have to pick one, I would say I think it's probably something like dinosaurs that were similar to hippo and a crocodile. But there's a reason why ancient Near East people used those creatures as examples of chaos and destruction. So it would be legitimate to say he's pointing to things that are seen as scary and chaotic. That's true. But I wouldn't point at that and say that's the only thing he's referring to personally. However, I think we spend a lot of time on that sometimes, and we forget why God talked about them in the first place. So that's what I want to do today as we go through it, is mainly focus, why does he draw your attention to behemoth or Leviathan? Why does he discuss this? Maybe you've thought of this question. Why didn't he talk about them in chapter 39 or 38 when he was talking about the rest of creation? Why did he separate them? And I think it's because he's making a different point. So when we talk about behemoth, here's what the case I want to make to you. He's telling you, you should, in some ways, be like behemoth. Let's read it. Verse 15. Notice the comparison he starts with. Behold, behemoth, which I made as I made you. He eats grass like an ox. His strength is in his loins, and his power is in the muscles of his belly. He makes his tail stiff like a cedar. The sinews of his thighs are knit together. His bones are tubes of bronze. His limbs like bars of iron. And you say, like, that doesn't sound a lot like me. No, but at the beginning, your attention is drawn to, here's behemoth. God says, I made it. And I made you. He hasn't said that about other creatures. He's drawing Job's attention to the fact that there's a similarity here. Well, the section we just read emphasizes that behemoth has strength in his tail, in his bones, in his legs, all over. Behemoth is a strong creature because God designed him that way. Can you imagine if you can imagine, take roughly a dinosaur, kind of a hippo-like dinosaur. Imagine that as a behemoth. Now then imagine that creature decided, I'm actually a bird. That's never going to work, right? A hippo can't build a nest in a tree. A hippo can't fly. Why? Because though God has given the hippo strength, it doesn't have that kind of strength, not the kind that can fly. When the hippo lives according to God's good design, or the behemoth lives according to God's good design, it has a lot of strength. It's powerful. What else does it have? If you go on to verse 20, for the mountains yield food for him. Who made the mountains? Who put the food there? God did. Where all the wild beasts play. Under the lotus plants he lies, in the shelter of the reeds and in the marsh, and for his shade the lotus trees cover him. The willows of the brook surround him. Behold, if the river is turbulent, he is not frightened. So he goes through, he says there's strength, there's also provision. God's given him shade, God's given him food, and God designed him to eat the food. God designed him to live in the shade. By God's unique design, Behemoth has strength and provision. So what does he do? He lives the way God designed him to live, according to his strength. He doesn't try to build nests in trees. So what happens? Well, if the river is turbulent, he's not frightened. He is confident, though Jordan rushes against his mouth. Can one take him by his eyes or pierce his nose with a snare? He lives in fearless, unconquered confidence. If you were to walk out and there was a giant hippo-like dinosaur in the parking lot, I don't think any of our first reactions would be, I'm just going to go scare that thing away. Much less if you were to find its habitat where it normally eats and it's in the marshes, you just go, I'm just going to jump in, he'll probably leave. You are not doing that. And he's not afraid of you. Because God has given him specific, unique strength and specific, unique provision. So even if the Jordan River comes rushing at him, which if it came rushing at you or I when we're standing in the Jordan River, we would be worried. Or dead. He's not worried. He's living in the strength God's designed, with the provision God's designed. He's fearless, unconquered. No one can snare him. And he's confident. That's the equation that he's putting before Job. Subtly, because he wants Job to hear it. Subtly, he's saying this: in my design, when my creatures live according to the strength I've given them, in the provision I've given them, and they trust that, they find fearless, unconquered confidence. Job, be like that. Job, I've given you strength. I've provided that. Trust me, and don't be afraid. You say, well, what does that look like when a human does it? I think it looks like the Apostle Paul. Did the Apostle Paul trust in the provision that God had given? He said, in whatever state I am, I know how to be content. If I have a lot, if I have a little, I trust in your provision, God. Did he have strength? Sure, he knew there was weakness, but he said, God's grace is sufficient for me. And if you read all the things that happened to him, did he live in the strength that God had given him out of that design? Absolutely. In fact, he said, I worked harder than all the others because it's God who works within me. I'm trusting in that strength. He trusted God even in suffering, that the thorn in the flesh, the suffering he had, he said, that is for my good, that I wouldn't be proud. And God's grace is sufficient so I can boast in my weaknesses and rejoice. Did he have fearless, unconquered confidence? Sure, he said, you want to kill me? To live is Christ, to die is gain. The Apostle Paul trusted in God's strength that God had given him specifically, the provision that God had given him. He trusted, and he was confident and bold. God says, for all of my creatures, here's how they are to live. With designed dependence. I made you, I designed you, and as you go through sufferings, God has given you strengths that he has not given me. God has given each of us unique strengths. From your personality, from your background, from your spiritual growth. Some of you endure hardships out of strength that others around you would say, I could never do that. God's given you provision in a million different ways. Trust in that and live a life of fearless confidence. You say, but what if the situation is like Job's and it's really bad? Well, we get where Paul got, which is even if every moment of this life is terrible, That's a light momentary affliction compared to what is coming. We trust our God so much that his strength and his provision for eternity is worth trusting. It's worth being fearless now, and we can be fearless now, even when suffering comes. God looks at Job and says, this is the way my creatures live, and you can live that way too. But there's another point. He goes to talk about Leviathan. This is a little weird way to say it, so track me this way, and I'll say it a different way, but I think it helps us to think. He's telling Job, don't treat God the same way you don't treat the Leviathan. I know that's terrible grammar. But he's saying, you would never do this to the Leviathan, so don't do it to me. So here's what he says. Can you draw out Leviathan with a fishhook? Just use a crocodile for the moment in your head. Can you go fishing and just pull out a 12-foot croc? No. Or press down his tongue with a cord, or put a rope in his nose, or pierce his jaw with a hook? Will he make pleas to you? Will he beg you for mercy? Will he speak to you soft words? Will he make a covenant with you? Just let me serve you, I'll be fine. Will you play with him like a bird? I noticed Amanda didn't ask us for an alligator. A parrot sitting on your shoulder is one thing, an alligator, not so much. Or will you put him on a leash for your girls? You go, we've got a little pet, a little dog. Okay, how about a little pet alligator? You want an 8-foot one. You don't do that. Can you fill his skins with harpoons or his head with fishing spears? Lay your hands on him. Remember the battle, you won't do it again. Behold, the hope of a man is false. He is laid low even at the sight of him. No one is so fierce that he dares to stir him up. So far, he's just talked about Leviathan. But just like at the beginning of Behemoth, he said, notice one thing, I made Behemoth just like I made you. Now he gets to his one thing to notice about Leviathan. Halfway through verse 10. Who then is he who can stand before me? Who has first given to me that I should repay him? Whatever is under the whole heaven is mine. He says, Job, you don't tame Leviathan, so don't come trying to put me on a leash. Don't come taming me. You wouldn't do that. He says, you can't do anything to Leviathan. You don't hurt him. You can't get to him. You lose the fight before you get there. Don't try to domesticate me either. You can't overpower God, and you can't use your ideas to tame him and put him in your debt. That's what Job has tried to do. I've done these good things, so I have to be treated this way. God, here's your leash. Don't go outside it. Job's friends have done the same thing. They've said, if you do God, God will do good for you. We can try to tame him in so many ways. We treat him like he's our genie in a bottle. God, I'll trust you and love you as long as give me this wish. Or we might treat him like he's our cosmic butler, like his job is just to get things for us. That's just trying to tame God, to domesticate him, to say, I'm the master, you're the servant. God continues, we won't read it for sake of time, but in the rest of the chapter, he just goes on to say, here's what Leviathan is. And that statement in the middle draws your attention. Why is he telling you about Leviathan? Because just like Leviathan is powerful and strong and you can't tame him, you also can't tame God and put him in your debt. So what's Job's answer? You get to 42. He says, God, I know that you can do all things. You have all power. I won't try to put you on a leash. And that no purpose of yours can be thwarted. Your purpose is unstoppable. Which means if you gave me strength and provision so that I can trust in you fearlessly, that can happen. Your purpose will not be thwarted. He quotes what God's question was. Who is this that hides counsel or providence without knowledge? Who darkened it? Who threw shade on it and said, this design may not be so good? Job says, it was me. Therefore I have uttered what I did not understand, things too wonderful for me, which I did not know. Notice here he says, these things were too wonderful. They were too good. At first he said, I can't correct everything that you know. Now he's saying, your design is not only beyond me, your design is wonderful. It's one thing to say, I can't comprehend all of God. It's another thing to say, it's all good, even when I can't comprehend it. Job still wants to understand, and I'm so glad he does, because I would feel like I could never possibly get where he does. He still gets here and says, hear and I will speak. I will question you and you make it known to me. But now he's not saying, God, why? Because I think you're wrong. Now he's coming saying, this is far beyond me and it's too wonderful for me to understand. But Lord, would you help your child to know? Help me to know what I need to know. He comes and he says, your design is beautiful and good. I'm a trusting child, but I do want to understand more of it. There's nothing wrong with that posture. There's nothing wrong with wanting to understand more. There's something wrong with the arrogance that says, if I don't understand, where I don't understand, you're probably wrong. He continues, I had heard of you by the hearing of the ear, but now my eye sees you. Therefore, I despise myself and repent in dust and ashes. One little translation thing I will say there. When he says, I despise myself, there's not really an object. It doesn't say myself. Technically, it says, I despise and repent. I think our modern ears would hear, I despise myself differently than what's intended there. The idea, I believe, is to say, the things that I've said is probably, because there's no object stated. It's not every piece of me is so wretchedly terrible. It's I despise all of that sinfulness that I'm turning from. I'm still a good creature of God. I'm still made by him. This is all good. But he's sitting here saying, I look at the things I've said, I look at what I've done, and that's awful. I turn from it, and I trust in you. I'll summarize the rest of chapter 42. You could read it for yourself. The next section, God says, Job, while he's not been perfect on all of his views of God, he has said some very right things about God. He's always held throughout the book, God is the one worth having, not stuff. That was the challenge at the beginning of the book. Does Job love your stuff more than he loves you? And throughout the book, he's never said, I've got to have my stuff. Job's friends, on the other hand, have acted like God could be tamed. They've acted like prosperity was actually more important than God. And so God criticizes them. God says, you need Job to pray for you. And Job does. And we learn that in the end, his friends see we've spoken wrong things about God. God has told us that. Job's fortunes are restored. He ends up more prosperous than he began. Now, I want to pause there and say, the moral of this story, the fact that you ought to trust in God's good design, in the strength he gives you, the provision he gives you, and the way he will work it all for good. That moral does not change, even if Job died in his suffering and his poverty. Because we have more than just Job. And we would say, if Job had died at that moment, while his trust rested in God, he would have eternal riches. So this gives us a picture in his life that says, he had this, he lost it, God restored it. If it happened to be that in God's wisdom, he had prosperity, he lost it, had poverty, he died, and then in resurrection he has eternal riches, God is still good to Job. So the moral doesn't really change. This is a picture within his life, not something that says you will have to get restoration at the end of the suffering. God is good to his people. And I thought, I won't take too long to go down this road, but this thought struck me today. As we look at Job, be like Behemoth. You have strength, provision, trust, so that you can have fearless confidence. How were Job's fortunes restored? It tells you in there that friends came and gave him. There was generosity. How did Job have more children? How did Job have more animals? Job trusted what God had done. God didn't just create livestock in his field. He had money, he went about business, he bought animals, he had children, just like he had the children before. He lived saying, God designed me, I'm going to depend on him and trust him exactly the way he's designed me. And that's what God used to restore his fortunes, along with generosity from his friends. And so the book concludes with Job out of suffering. It says, Job died an old man and full of days. Now, I want to take just a minute and hit a couple of big picture thoughts, which we've talked about as we come to the end of Job, to say, how do we wrestle with? It's a weird old story that's so far from our lives and yet so close to our lives, because we don't suffer like Job, but we do suffer. First thing is this: the book never answers the question, why do the righteous suffer? As much as we want the answer for why, and as much as God gives us some partial answers for why throughout the Bible, the book never answers that question. The question the book answers is, how should righteous people live in this world that has suffering? He never says you'll get every answer for why suffering comes. He says, here's how you live in a world that does have suffering, which I think you could sum up from what he says about Behemoth. How do you live? Fearlessly trust in God's design for provision and strength and suffering. And don't try to tame God. That's how we should live. That's how a righteous person should live in a world that has suffering. And if we say part of how we should live is to trust, to fearlessly trust, you can't trust if there aren't hard times, right? You can, but you can't display it. Put it that way. If everything goes your way, how do you know you're trusting in something? If you trust in your insurance, for example, your medical insurance, that may be a bad place to put your trust, depending on who you're with. But if you trust in your medical insurance, and there's never a place where you use it, how would you ever display that you trust in it? Suffering is an opportunity to display trust in a different way than we do when there's prosperity. So the book doesn't answer why do righteous people suffer, although it gives some hints. Second thing, I want to ask you, how do we try to tame God? We might demand that he must operate according to our plans. As long as I can understand how you're working, God, then okay. But if I can't understand it, then no. And I think maybe, if I could use this picture, maybe we don't try to tame God by taking a lion and making it a house cat. We all know that's not going to work out very well, and we know I can't do that with God. But maybe we think I'm going to tame God like I'm going to take the lion and I'm going to put him in the zoo. I'm not going to just pet him and let him eat in my kitchen and drink milk there, but I'm still going to put him in a box that says he has to act this way. In neither of those, we don't tame God in either of those ways. We come, and Job is telling you, the book of Job is saying, he's God and you're not. I think most of us would affirm that gladly. And I'll tell you what I've found in my heart as I've gone through this book. The problem is I will affirm I'm God and he is not all the time. But here's how I want to change it sinfully. I want to say I'm God. No, he's God. I do want to say that sometimes, but that's not what I'm saying. I want to say he is God and I am not quite God. I don't want to take his place. But I'm wise enough and important enough and strong enough that God does owe me some answers. What God's doing, he's not sitting here saying, I'm God, you're not, so mind your own business. That's not the kind of God we serve. He's not saying, I'm God, you're not, I can do whatever I want. He's not saying, I'm God, you're not, so you're worthless. What he's doing is saying, I'm God, you're not, so I can handle far more than you can. I care deeply about you, and I have the wisdom and power to handle all of that. So trust me even when you don't understand. That's what I am God and you are not means. Not you're worthless, but don't try to handle more than you can. I have the power and wisdom to handle that. Let me. That's what God says. I care about you enough that you don't have to do that yourself. God wants you to know throughout this book, if I were to say the two things there, how should righteous people live in this world without suffering? And how do I need to be careful to not tame God? Those are two big lessons. The last one I'll say is this: God wants you to know his eternal purposes more than he wants you to know his temporal reasons. Think of the man born blind in John. Why was this man born blind? So that God's glory would be seen through him. Jesus doesn't give you the reason, if you will. He gives you the purpose. Think of Lazarus, who dies. He never directly tells you, well, why exactly did he die here? But here's the purpose. It was so that God's power and glory would be seen through resurrection. Romans 5 tells us suffering exists so that we will not be put to shame because God's love has been poured into our hearts. That's a purpose. Not a reason, like here's what happened and therefore this punishment comes, but a purpose. God is doing this. Corinthians says he is preparing for us an eternal weight of glory. That's a purpose, not a temporal reason, but an eternal purpose for suffering. Where Peter says, you suffer for a little while so that the tested genuineness of your faith, more precious than gold that perishes, that was tried by fire, may be found to result in praise and glory and honor at the revelation of Jesus Christ. That's a purpose. God doesn't give you all the reasons. He says, I'm the God who loves you and I can handle all the reasons. Trust my purposes. I'd like to invite you to respond to the truth that we've heard, to close your eyes and spend a moment in prayer and trust towards the God who in difficulties and in good times, he's still God, and we are not, but he loves us.